So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Quebec's Anglophone Communities and the Legacies of the Quebec Act. I am Patrick Donovan, Research Associate and Advisor at the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network at Concordia University, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Concordia University recognizes the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters where it is located. Jojake, Montreal has long been a gathering place for many First Nations and remains home to a diverse population today. And today we're discussing Guy Carleton, whose Quebec Act was a step forward for Francophones in Quebec. However, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, Carleton had a more utilitarian and perhaps distant approach, acknowledging their military value at the time of the American Revolution. But it's worth noting that there was no equivalent to the Quebec Act for Indigenous people that allowed for greater legal and cultural affirmation. And we see the ongoing legacy of that today, which needs to be addressed if we are to work towards reconciliation and build a Quebec that allows a just and respectful place for all its constituent groups. The event today is made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, and QUESCREN also receives funding from Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. Please note that this is a space for intellectual exchange and that any views or opinions expressed in this talk do not necessarily represent those of QUESCREN, its staff, or its funders. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jane McGaughey. Jane McGaughey is the Johnson Chair of Quebec and Canadian Irish Studies at Concordia University and holds a stated research mandate to highlight the contributions of the Irish and their descendants in Quebec since the mid-18th century. She's an associate professor in Irish Diaspora Studies. Reminder again, if you have any questions for Dr. McGaughey about the presentation, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A box, and we will address them during the Q&A period after the panel. I will now pass the mic on to you, Jane.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And I will be sharing my screen. Is the screen share working for everyone? Can you see this now? Yep.
Working, yes.
Perfect. All right. So I'm really delighted to be here today and to speak to all of you about Guy Carleton and the Quebec Act and the research that I've been doing about him for the past year. But I'm not going to start with him. I'm going to start with a much more famous person in modern Quebec. In November of 1987, René Lévesque, the first Parti Québécois premier of Quebec, died. There was an outpouring of grief, and very soon there was a discussion about how to properly honor him within the city of Montreal. One of his cabinet ministers, Guy Chevrette, wrote, "We're losing a father. He's a man who gave us life by founding the Parti Québécois." And one of his rivals, Claude Ryan, had said, and this is a quote from within the Globe and Mail, "Because of him and Bill 101, the French character of Quebec cannot be erased. In politics, Monsieur Lévesque brought people together, but he was also a solitary man," Mr. Ryan said. He called Monsieur Lévesque a man who could be unpitying, even cruel towards his opponents, and often unpredictable and enigmatic with his allies. Now, when I read that in doing some of the research for this, I suddenly was like, those words sound very familiar because they could just as easily have been applied to Guy Carleton. And Carleton very quickly became part of the discussion of how to honor René Lévesque. As many of you will know, before the end of 1987, the main east-west artery on the island of Montreal was known as Dorchester Boulevard. This was then decided to be changed, and it would instead become Boulevard René Lévesque, which it still is today. There was quite a bit of discussion within the Montreal Gazette about how the community was reacting to this decision. Now, when I started to do the research, I presumed that this would become very quickly part of the English-French debate about the future of Quebec that I certainly grew up with, having been born in the 80s. And so I was surprised to find this piece by Don McPherson within the Gazette, roughly 2 weeks after Lévesque had died. I do feel a slight twinge at the thought of another English name disappearing from the face of Quebec, particularly one of such historical significance. Baron Dorchester was a governor of Quebec after the British conquest who played a part in having the British Parliament adopt the Quebec Act of 1774, which protected the French language, the Roman Catholic religion, and the civil law system. But If the French-speaking majority of Montreal's citizens, presumably the principal surviving beneficiaries of Dorchester's action, have no objection to seeing his name disappear, then I certainly don't. Other opinions that existed at the same time that were reported upon usually focused on the negative cost that this might have for the city. Famously, the mayor of Montreal Les decided not to change the name of the boulevard. And then there was the reaction from the city itself saying quite quickly that Dorchester's name would be moved to what had formerly been known as Dominion Square. And this seemed to be able to honor both men at the same time. The city of Westmount, what is now the city of Westmount, was then part of Montreal, I believe, certainly stood apart at this point. And I wasn't very much surprised to find that, considering that Westmount has been traditionally known as somewhat of an Anglophone enclave on the island. At a council meeting, the mayor, May Cutler, had announced that the city of Westmount was not going to follow what Montreal was doing, and that instead they needed to take time in order to reflect on what to do next. And when I first was reading through this, I thought, okay, typical possible reaction. And then I read her comments that she gave to the reporters immediately after the council meeting had ended, where she said, "It's a dreadful street to name after anybody, a cold, hard business street." So it certainly wasn't that they were trying to defend Dorchester's place within the landscape of the city. They just didn't think that someone like René Lévesque, who was beloved, should have such a street named after him. The then head of history here at Concordia, Graham Decarie, agreed. He wrote, "Here's the death of a warm man who was loved by the people, and we're naming a bleak street of sterile high rises after him. We should be renaming a street of low rises, spiral staircases, and dépanneurs, with a lot of people on the street." He then later, a few days, when he was interviewed at the end of the month, said that the mayor of Montreal could have announced his plan, then held hearings and gotten people to agree. Instead, his stupid political sense made the English perceive this as an attack on another English place name. So I wanted to sort of get into how the street change had sort of sponsored a lot of my interest in Carleton, because this was coming at a time when we have seen a lot of names of places, particularly from the colonial period, change in Canada. But this was happening in 1987, 1988. This long predates anything since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. So a few quick facts about Guy Carleton before I get into sort of his relationship with the Anglophone community 200 years ago. He was an Irishman, which is often forgotten. He wore a British uniform. He was part of the British Army, but was a very proud man from County Tyrone in what is now Northern Ireland. He had served his entire life in the British Army. He had been a young teenager when he had first joined up. He had then become a favorite of General James Wolfe, and had become his quartermaster at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. After the conquest and then the Treaty of Paris in 1763, he was sent away from Quebec, but returned in 17, I'm used to the 1800s, in 1767, and then became governor in 1768. During this time as governor, many things happened. The Quebec Act, which had been discussed earlier in that quote from the Gazette, famously the defense of Quebec City from an American invasion at the end of 1775. And then also he was involved in defending British interests during the American Revolution, particularly during the final evacuation of New York City. He then was Governor General of the Canadas from 1785 to 1795, was recreated as Lord Dorchester as a baron, and then left the province for the final time in 1796, and then retired to his estates in England, and there he died. So there's your sort of summary of who he is. But my questions are, why does he matter in this? And because this was coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Quebec Act, and because I always teach my students that the Quebec Act is kind of the birth certificate of sorts of modern Canada, everything that we now think of as being very Canadian can really be found in the pluralism that the Quebec Act really promoted. I wanted to ask, to what extent is this remembered by the Anglophone communities today in Quebec? How did that relationship go back and forth between Carleton as a man, but also eventually also his memory? What kind of physical monuments, memorials, tributes have existed, like Dorchester Boulevard, and which ones still exist? How have historians judged Carleton and the Quebec Act over the past 250 years? And then finally, are they still relevant today? I argue that yes, they are, but I'm increasingly, I feel a bit alone in that. So I'm hoping that today and then some of my future research on this will start to perhaps shift the conversation just a little bit. If you were to become a Canadian citizen today, you do have to know who Guy Carleton was. This is part of the citizenship brochure that the federal government puts out, which is then required reading for your citizenship test. And you can see Carleton there in the top right of the screen. And there is a mention of the Quebec Act on the page as one of our constitutional foundations. The government of Quebec absolutely remembers him within their official website and note, again, his shepherding of the Quebec Act as being a key moment because his recommendations and attempt to protect the act while in London managed to secure it. The reason why this was such a landmark decision is because of how the British government usually did things and their imperial policies that had existed up to that point. This is a map of British North America in 1763, and you can see the American, what will be the American colonies, then the 13 colonies, so British possessions, Quebec there served with the slanted line on it. And it was then very much curtailed compared to how New France had been. And there was a precedent for how they could possibly treat Quebec that lay, ironically, in Carleton's Irish roots. Ireland was held up at the time in the 1770s as a template, but it was unclear whether it was something that should be emulated or something that really should be avoided because of how British policies had been extremely punitive to Catholics in Ireland and any dissenting religions through what's known as the Irish penal laws. The penal laws had been in effect from 1695 and really wouldn't end until 1829. That's when the last of them fell, because that's the moment that the Westminster Parliament finally allowed Roman Catholics to stand for election and to become members of Parliament. The Quebec Act guaranteed that for French Canadian citizens in 1774, decades beforehand. But if the government had wanted to go ahead with continuing the more punitive measures against the French Canadian population, it could have been that they would eventually have been expelled, as had happened with the Acadians, or that they would be continually punished and basically made second-class citizens because of their religion. Carleton grew up with the Irish penal law system. His family had benefited from it. He was one of the small minority, less than 10% of people on the island of Ireland who were Anglican, and therefore were considered the established religion of the island. But historians have shown that he had decided that was not the way to work with the Canadian population in what was then Quebec. This is the quote from Aaron Willis, who's worked a lot on the Quebec Act. And he frames it that Carleton's arguments were similar to those who were critiquing the Irish model, who didn't want to see Quebec become a second Ireland. He certainly did not argue for the creation of an Anglo-Canadian elite to mirror his Anglo-Irish roots. And that is where some of the problems lay with his reception by the Anglophone community in Quebec in the 1770s, because he didn't want to give them the preferred status that he himself had grown up with back in Ireland. When you find some of the words to describe Carleton, they're very varied. The documents from the time often referred to him as being severe and sour and morose, but also benevolent and just and humane. Historians have talked about him being ruthless and reactionary, but also intrepid and honorable. There's really no main consensus. He was complicated, I think, to say the least. This is not helped by the fact that we don't have his private papers anymore. We don't know his actual thoughts about either the French Canadians or the Anglophone community in terms of how he was thinking of them in his own personal space, because he burned everything on his deathbed, and that makes me want to throttle him every time I think of it. Instead, we have some of his comments about the Anglophones that he had been meeting in Quebec in his dispatches to members of the Colonial Office. One of those people was a man from Ireland called John McCord, and he was eventually his descendants, the McCords, would become quite famous within Montreal. This is what he wrote about John. Lately, when John McCord, who wants neither sense nor honesty, and formerly kept a small alehouse in the poor suburbs of a little country town in the north of Ireland, appearing zealous for the Presbyterian faith and having made a little money, has gained some credit among people of his sort. This person purchased some spots of ground and procured grants of more close to the barracks, where he ran up sheds and placed poor people to sell his spirits to the soldiers, finding that his lucrative trade had lately been checked to prevent the soldiers getting drunk all hours of the day and night. He has commenced Patriot, and with the assistance of the late Attorney General and three or four more, egged on by letters from home, are at work again for an assembly. What they wanted to have created was an assembly that basically would be filled only with Anglophone Protestants who lived in Quebec, and it would mirror what existed for the Irish Parliament, another thing that John McCord would have grown up with. And Carleton despised this idea. He felt that, on the other hand, the better sort of Canadians fear nothing more than popular assemblies, which they conceive tend only to render the people refractory and insolent, and that they should think themselves unhappy if a like misfortune befell them. He then gets even plainer about why he has this kind of distrust of an assembly and that he wants something, to be blunt, a bit more autocratic. He's afraid of republicanism. You can see here with the red arrow, a popular assembly which preserves its full vigor, and in a country where all men appear nearly upon a level, must give a strong bias to republican principles. Guy Carleton was afraid that the Anglophone community in Quebec was ready to become a Republican hotbed, and that to counter that, he needed to make sure that the assembly was never going to become a reality. And because of confusion and dissent within the Anglophone community itself, it never really had any major power and then was removed by the Quebec Act itself. The key man who stood against Carleton in the 1770s to represent particularly Anglophone merchants from Montreal was the notorious Thomas Walker. And I have to explain, I'm married to a man called Thomas Walker, so I find this element within the story absolutely hilarious. But this Thomas Walker was certainly by Carleton seen as a very bad man and someone who was quite volatile, and you never quite knew what he would do next. He'd arrived up in Montreal from Boston in the 1760s, right after the final terms of the conquest, and had very quickly established himself as a loud voice within the Anglophone community. He then had been approached by the then governor, James Murray, to become a justice of the peace. And I think this was a case of Murray kind of trying to keep his friends close but enemies closer, and to sort of keep an eye on Walker, and hopefully by giving him some type of power, it would mollify him. But it doesn't seem to have worked, because Walker then became very much incensed with the British military presence in Quebec, which would actually mirror what a lot of other merchants were feeling in places like Boston, and throughout the 13 colonies. And so he kept taking a stand against the army and things like the Quartering Act that would allow them to billet in various houses. The fracas ended up with Walker actually being attacked in the middle of the night in 1764 and having his ear and part of his cheek cut off. And there are very gory details that you can read from his wife's testimony of it. This certainly made Walker angry with the authorities because he felt they were not protecting him properly. He then became even more angry when the soldiers who had been accused of the crime were then fully exonerated, and he felt it was a conspiracy. And this was then going to set him up to always be kind of a thorn in any administrator's side. And he certainly then had decided to go after Carleton once he realized Carleton was not on the side of the Anglophones. And we know this because we can see from one of Carleton's quotes, "This country must to the end of time be peopled by the Canadian race," meaning French Canadians, "who have already taken such firm root and got to so great a height that any new stock transplanted will be totally hid and imperceptible amongst them, except in the towns of Quebec and Montreal, where the Anglophone presence was more noticeable, if not a majority." In order to achieve the Quebec Act, ironically, none of it really happened in Quebec itself. Everything had to be done in London. Carleton left for London in 1770, and Thomas Walker followed him very quickly. And the two men were trying to gather support in England for their disparate causes for the next 4 years. Carleton, however, wasn't only in London. He at this point became something of a romantic figure, which I hadn't expected to find when I was doing the research. Grew up with him as being known as the father of British Canada. This is a book that was written about him in the early 1900s. And instead, the more I heard about his time in London and really the surrounding counties, it became more clear that really Guy Carleton belongs in a Bridgerton novel. And if you will indulge me, I will explain. And I will explain with the help of gifts from Sense and Sensibility. And Alan Rickman will now be playing the role of Guy Carleton. Just bear with me. Carleton had been friends with the second Earl of Effingham for many, many years and knew the family very well. Effingham had two daughters, Lady Anne Howard and Lady Maria Howard. And Carleton had basically been not a godfather, but friend of the family, but of their father's age, certainly. But Thomas Howard, their father, had realized that Guy Carleton was becoming extremely important within the Anglophone world. He was the governor of Quebec, a huge piece of land. And so he decided that he wanted Guy Carleton not only to be his old friend, but his son-in-law. And he encouraged him to propose to the older daughter, Lady Anne. Apparently, Anne was told to go and meet Carleton in a locked room, and there he proposed. She then fled the room in floods of tears, and when her sister and a cousin said, "What is going on?" Anne apparently, through choky words, said, "You would cry if you had to turn down the best man in the world." So, Bridgerton-y. It turns out that Anne, this is so soap opera, Anne was already in love with Carleton's nephew, who was a colonel in the British Army, Christopher Carleton. And so she didn't want to marry the uncle. She wanted the nephew for herself. And on hearing this, Anne's younger sister, Maria, thought that her sister was basically an idiot, and apparently said, "More fool you, if only he had asked me." The cousin overheard this and then went to tell Carleton what she had overheard. He, of course, is still just wanting to find a wife at this point. And so very quickly, he then proposed to Maria instead of Anne. This is roughly at the most about 2 weeks apart. And they were married. And it was a very successful marriage. They had 11 children. And the age difference here that we see between Alan Rickman and Kate Winslet is bang on. Carleton was 48 and Lady Maria was 19. This is what they actually look like. The Hollywood version doesn't quite work. But he came back being written up in some of the newspaper reports as this sort of not quite swashbuckling. They didn't have that nomenclature entirely yet, but this very sort of capital R romantic hero, bringing the lady with him, who eventually would be called Lady Dorchester. He also brought with him, though, the Quebec Act. So for those of you who might not have taken a Canadian history course, here's just a brief summary of what's in it and why it's really important today. He abolished the Assembly, which was the thing that Thomas Walker and John McCord and others had been really wanting to have, because he was worried that it would be too biased in favor of the Anglophones of Quebec. Instead, he was going to be the government. It would be through governor and an appointed council that he himself would appoint. But this is the key thing for today, certainly. Roman Catholics were given political rights and the right to hold public office, which was unheard of in the entire British Empire. It was a complete break with British policy. On top of that, the Catholic Church was going to flourish under Carleton because they were allowed to have their religious tithe of 10% of all incomes. So the church would be getting money again. And what we have today still is the change that was made to the legal system, where here in Quebec, it is English law for criminal cases, but it's the French law for civil cases. And that was then updated to the Napoleonic Code in time. But what this allowed was for the return of the seigneurial system, which really pleased the French Canadian elites and the church. Probably not so much the regular Canadians. But Carleton was wanting to get the support basically of people who would be power players as opposed to the large majority. And the final thing is that the Western territories were restored to Quebec. What this means, you can see in blue, that was the size of Quebec in 1773 and had been for 10 years. Then it was very much enlarged to include a large part of what is now America. And you can see the 13 colonies there are pinned in. They will not be able to expand to the west. This is why the Quebec Act in America was immediately called one of the intolerable acts. And if you read the works of, say, Benjamin Franklin, it's really seen as the worst of the various acts that the British government had imposed upon the colonists of the 13 colonies, along with the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, and others that were already leading them towards the eventual revolution. But the Quebec Act was seen as giving in to Catholics. And there you can see this sort of cartoon of the king, who's beneath Satan on the left, giving all of his power to Catholic bishops. Thomas Walker was infuriated by what had happened, and felt this was a complete betrayal of everything that made Britain British. And he then became a full American patriot and started a secret cell in Montreal that was starting to send news and eventually supplies to people like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty in Boston. When Boston was blockaded, Walker sent in, I believe it's 3,000 bushels of wheat, and he received an official commendation from the American government once it was established after 1776. Carleton knew that Walker was a problem, and he knew that there were cells following Walker both in Montreal and in Quebec. But he felt that this could be curtailed because he believed at that point that the French Canadian population would come out to support the crown in vast numbers because of the amazing concessions that they had been awarded through the Quebec Act. Also, Carleton had a bigger problem on his mind, which was American invasion. Two places were invaded in 1775. Montreal was taken by a man many of you might have heard of called Benedict Arnold, basically without a shot being fired. And the man who welcomed him as the city was taken over was Thomas Walker. What you can see here in front of you, though, is the Battle of Quebec, the final Battle of Quebec in 1775. I'm hoping there's going to be something said about it at the end of this year, but we'll see. But it is the 250th anniversary of it this year. And Carleton secured a major victory and stopped the American invasion. During the Revolutionary period, he also became very famous in places what are now Nova Scotia and surrounding areas because of what he did in terms of the evacuation of New York. He not only helped loyalists to escape and settle in the eastern townships and Nova Scotia and what became New Brunswick, but also was really important in making sure that George Washington would not get former slaves returned to him, which was a demand that Washington had made and is making in this painting. Carleton absolutely refused. Other British officials then followed what Carleton did. And one of the most recent books about Carleton that was published, I believe, in about 2022, has claimed that arguably upwards of 50,000 former slaves were able to escape from American control because of what Carleton did during this meeting, during the evacuation of New York. This means that, Carleton has had a huge effect, not only on Quebec history, but, global history itself. What I didn't expect to find in some of my research, though, was also that he was a bit of an agony aunt for the Anglophone community. Once the war had started against America, the Anglophone community became a bit more fond of Carleton and saw him less antagonistic and more as sort of the pater familias. These are various letters that I found that were written to him in Q from people in Montreal. Some are asking for sanctuary as they're coming north, so loyalists looking for assistance. But the two on the right are from women, both of whom are asking him to intervene in their relationships because one woman had been abandoned by her husband. Another one is wanting to make sure that the soldier she's in love with is not sent away. And so this was an aspect of Carleton that when you know him just as this remote, cool, distant figure, you certainly don't expect. So this leads me back to sort of the anniversary that occurred last year. It was the 250th anniversary, and there had been quite a bit of remark in the press in 1999 for the 225th. So I was keen to see what was going to be reported on. And the answer is really not much. There was one article in Le Devoir a few days before the passage of the Quebec Act. It was going to be on the 22nd of June. This was from the 18th. Talking about basically the current state of the sovereigntist movement in Quebec. There was one article in the Gazette published in April of last year that referenced the Quebec Act as a reason for separatists not to position an erasure of Québécois society because the Quebec Act had been the original reason why French Canadian culture had been protected as opposed to being assimilated within the larger parts of British North America. And then this doesn't quite count as a Quebec commentary, but it's from Ottawa, so I fudged it a little. But this is from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where it talks about the fact that the Quebec Act is our proto-constitutional bedrock, but also that it's almost completely forgotten today for a variety of reasons, but also mainly because people don't tend to look further than 1867 in order to find the roots of Canada. And of course, Canada had existed for centuries before that. Then there's the question of how would Carleton be discussed? Because there was a move a few years ago to cancel him of a sort. During the understandable consequences of the Truth and Reconciliation Act, the change of names, particularly around Ryerson and Johnny MacDonald, there was a question of whether or not Carleton's name should be removed, but not here in Quebec, in Ontario. So I wondered if I was going to find something similar. So far, there hasn't been any call, but he is in a dangerous position, arguably, because he is from the colonial period, and that is now seen as one of the more controversial periods. Certainly, you can't have a nuanced discussion about it on X/Twitter. So I then decided through the research to try and look at what physically is available about Carleton. And it's a part of the project that really I've only been able to really dig into more or less over the past month and a half. So I wanted to show you a bit of the database that I'm currently creating about this. It's basically a cultural geography of where Carleton and the Quebec Act are remembered. The Quebec Act doesn't leave much of a physical footprint at all, unless you count, the boundaries of provinces. But Carleton has a number, this is just a small sample, a huge number of places that are named after him, but no one really remembers who he is. If you plot it out on the map, you can see, of course, there's a lot in places like Ottawa, Carleton University, etc. But there is still a fair bit both in Montreal, Quebec City, and in the Eastern Townships as well. So I started to pull together where exactly are these and how is the language approached with these? Are these in French? Are these solely in English? Are they bilingual monuments? What do we have? So this is a list of what I've been able to find so far within the province of Quebec. Things like street names, I did separate out Westmount and Montreal, considering that the Westmount name still is in existence. But also places like the town of Carleton-sur-Mer, way up in the Gaspésie, and a number of places where the name either Dorchester or Carleton still exists for streets. We have a couple of plaques that you can still find that refer to him. This is at Bishop's University, but it's about the Loyalists. It doesn't make any reference to the Quebec Act. There are a lot of references to Carleton's role during the Siege of Quebec, this final battle that happened in 1775. Throughout Quebec City, they often are usually bilingual in nature. So this is one from the federal government, which you can see that was put up in the 1990s. These are older ones that were put up more in the 1920s, but the language between them is really quite similar. And in both, Guy Carleton's name is very, very visible. The same exists where one of the American generals, Richard Montgomery, who's also Irish, was killed. And so there's a memorial to that. But again, Carleton is commanding at Quebec. And then there's his statue, which so far has not been tried to be brought down outside of the National Assembly. It's still there this afternoon, rather, and is one of the only visual representations that we have of Carleton, and I think makes him look a lot better looking than he probably was in real life. There is the governor's mansion, which you can go and visit in Sorel-Tracy. And then here in Montreal, we do have Dorchester Square, but you wouldn't know it unless you're looking on a Google map because there is no actual naming of Dorchester Square. Most people still think of it in a way as Dominion Square. The Dominion Tavern is still there, and the streets around it are there's nothing that really has been renamed. There's no plaque here. This is a monument, I believe, to the Second South African War, so it's certainly not honoring Carleton's contribution in the 1770s. For the 225th anniversary, since I started with a Claude Ryan quote, I thought I would end with one as well. He said to the Gazette that for the time, the Quebec Act was a very moderate solution to a difficult problem. There was an aspect of noblesse. The British government was one of great class. They were statesmen who saw farther than their noses. The recognition of religious pluralism in the Canadian political tradition is a point that holds its importance to this day. And I think we can absolutely see that in terms of the question of church and state being separated in Canadian politics and daily life really has some of its beginnings in the Quebec Act. And the idea of pluralism, of being able to have more than just one monolithic society, is one of the things that defines us. At the time that Carleton was in his final years living in Quebec, the Quebec Gazette wrote this piece when he had just been arriving back from a visit to London, where they refer to him as the father of the colony. Long and repeated experience has taught the Canadians to repose the highest confidence in his lordship's fostering care of this colony. They look up to him as a father, nor do they appear to entertain in a more sincere wish than that he may be induced to spend the remainder of his valuable life amongst them, and that they may long enjoy the blessing of his mild and equitable government. Bit effusive, possibly. But when I found this, I then thought of the quote from Guy Chevret about L'évêque as the father of basically modern Quebec nationalism. And I think there's actually quite a bit of similarity that we might be able to plumb between the two men, and it doesn't just have to begin and end with the name of the boulevard. And I think that's where I will stop for today.
Thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. I like the GIFs.
Everyone likes the GIFs.
Yeah. So I will now take questions from the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, please write them into the Q&A box. I have a few of my own, but let's start with what's in the Q&A box now. We have a question from Hoffman Wolf, who asks, what does "he has commenced patriot" mean?
It means that he's turned Republican, that he's joined the American Patriot movement. It doesn't have anything to do with sort of the 1837 rebellions and Les Patriotes. It's just that in the 1770s, the Patriots were the reference amongst themselves for if you were wanting American independence from British control.
Got it. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. I have a question of my own. Why do you think the 250th anniversary of the Quebec Act received so little attention?
I don't have an easy answer. I think some of it is rooted in the fact that people just don't know about it to begin with. The way that history is taught in every province is very, very different, and it can vary from school to school. I will confess that both of my parents were Canadian historians and high school teachers, so I grew up with this as like dinner table conversation. But I did think there would be something, and I know that we're going to be hearing all sorts from America when it's their 250th anniversary next year. You know, it's the 250th of 1776, and Donald Trump is running the party. And so there's going to be a lot, and I think maybe there will be more of a discussion of the Quebec Act, but it's going to be from an American point of view, where they see it as one of the worst things that was ever passed in North America. And so I do feel that an opportunity was missed. I don't think it was in terms of a political decision to downplay it. I sadly think that people just don't know their history well enough, and that those who do usually are not able to have a huge platform that people can then sort of listen to, follow, etc. There was no Instagram account for the Quebec Act, and I don't think there ever will be.
Talk.
Oh God, no, I don't even know how that works. No.
Have you been able to follow a question from Pamela McGovern? Have you been able to follow Carleton's lineage? Did his family return to the UK after his death?
Yeah, he had 11 children, and the title did pass to sons afterwards, but the title did die out. So I believe that it's the his grandchildren are sort of when the lineage ends. There was a brief revival of the title, and then it hasn't been used, I think, since the 1890s. But you could, quick Wikipedia would be able to verify that. But in terms of his direct descendants, that didn't go on. His brother was the first governor of New Brunswick, which is why when I'm starting to look at Carleton's name being used across Canada and sort of this cultural geographic footprint, and I have to be really careful with New Brunswick because I don't know if it's after Guy or Thomas. If anything, it's called Carleton there. But there was nepotism within the family. His nephew Christopher got a very good position as well. So they were a powerful family for a time, but really not after about the 1820s.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. Were there many Irish Protestant critiques of the anti-Irish model in Ireland at the time? Like, how exceptional is Carleton? And, in context, were Irish Protestants more likely to be pro-Catholic in the 1700s than in the 1800s or 1900s? Because we know there's a
So
lot
it's
of tension there.
I mean, it varies. There were absolutely so the only people who could discuss the Quebec Act in Parliament in Westminster were Protestant, because Catholics weren't allowed in Parliament at that point. Um, and some of the Irish MPs and members of the House of Lords who were debating it absolutely did not want to see the Irish system emulated at all. There's, you can read reams of it in Hansard online. And but what I found really intriguing was one of the key Irish Protestant critics of the Quebec Act was Edmund Burke, who we now think of as sort of the father of small c modern conservatism. And he hated it because at the beginning of the 1770s, he was very much in favor of the rights of the American colonists. And he felt that in this case, since New France had been part of the losing side of the Seven Years' War, that they should be assimilated, and that all of North America should be British, in its own version of Manifest Destiny. And so he was very much against the Quebec Act, saw Carleton as a traitor of sorts, and spoke against it in Parliament. And I didn't really, I thought he would be taking a different side because it's offering Catholics rights, and he himself he was Protestant by practice, but his mother and sister were both Catholics, and he had called the Irish penal laws one of the worst inventions of mankind. So it didn't make sense to me why he would be defending the same system more or less to be used here in Quebec. But at that point, he felt that the rights of the colonists in Boston were more important than the rights of French Canadians here. And I have yet to find his writings if there was anything about Canada, say, after the French Revolution and how he might be thinking of it then. But that's some future reading for me to do.
I guess a related question from Lorraine O'Donnell.
Mhm.
Um, did what did Carleton have to say about the situation in Ireland? Was it, did he apply the same kind of pro-Catholic view, or do we know what he said about Ireland? And why
We
did he
know
take the British policy in these dramatic ways?
this is where some of his private papers would be so helpful, but they went up in smoke. So we know what he said to committees. Um, and you can find vague references to Ireland, not so much from his private Irish experience, but in terms of references to the penal laws in some of what he was saying to various committees when he was testifying as to why the Quebec Act should be passed. But what would have been wonderful to have would have been, a private letter to his father-in-law saying how he really felt about, you know, the Anglophones in Quebec and the possibility of creating an Anglo-Canadian elite to match the Anglo-Irish elites, or from the Willis quote. And we just don't have that because I think he knew that he had written some very dangerous things in his private papers, and that's why he had his wife burn everything in front of him as he lay dying. That's usually it's not so much that you want things to be burnt if you're that much of an official, and he absolutely did. So, I don't think it was just his version of recycling. I think he wanted to make sure there would be no trace.
Right. Devil's advocate question from Rod McLeod. Could we say
Yeah.
that in our zeal to applaud the Quebec Act's support of religious pluralism, we overlook its anti-democratic aspect?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's autocratic to the core. It's promoting feudalism, right? It brings back the seigneurial system roughly 15 years before the fall of the Bastille. So that was problematic. And it's one of the reasons, arguably, why Carleton was very disappointed that French Canadians did not turn out for the militia in huge numbers in 1775, 6, 7, the way he had thought they would. And he took that actually as a personal betrayal. But he did very much continue to support those who had supported him. So the French Canadian middle and upper classes and the Catholic Church remained a key focus for him and sort of on his side through the 1790s until the end of his term as governor. And but it is, governor and appointed council. He's a dictator. It's emulating some of the worst of 18th century policy, going all the way back to the Romans, if you want. But he felt that that was more appropriate in order to keep the Anglophone community in check. So he really was wanting to make sure that any attempt to exclude French Canada the way that Irish Catholics have been excluded would not be possible. And the only way he felt to do that was to take, he's a military man. So he took a very military position of, right, I'll run it. I'll run it myself. So I think you can see more of his sort of military training in some of that decision than necessarily his affection for having full control of everything himself.
Right. But to be fair, I mean, there wasn't a lot of democracy going around in the early 17th, like
No,
before the American Revolution.
this is 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, right?
Right.
So it's, democracy is seen as that Greek experiment that went awry, and that, you need to have, this is very Hobbesian, right? You need to have like a strong man, a Leviathan in charge, and he made himself the Leviathan of Quebec. And at least in some of the more sycophantic papers, they went for that imperial father idea of him. But it does fly in the face of what we now would think of as being a modern policy.
Sure. A question from Andrew Cadell, who brings up Ghislain Deschênes' book L'été des Anglais, which is about the burning of the South Shore of Quebec in 1759. He says that Carleton and Murray were in charge. Is that the case? And did they undertake a massive rebuilding of the Quebec after the conquest?
I know that Carleton was really concerned about the state of the infrastructure of Quebec when he became governor. And he was the lieutenant governor under Murray for a few years prior to taking over himself in 1768. So I have some letters from him from about 1766, 67, where he's worried about the possibility of famine. He's wanting buildings to be secure. He's wanting roads to be not paved by that point, but made more passable. And so the idea of rebuilding parts of the colony was very much on his mind, and therefore he saw sort of this press to exclude French Canadians from public life as sort of almost being self-defeating, because he wanted to make sure everyone would be involved in the rebuilding of the colony so that basically the population would survive. His fears of famine were very, very tangible.
I have a question of my own. What was the impact of the Quebec Act in Ireland? I mean, the Irish see Catholics getting rights in North America, or did it provoke anything there?
Well, it's still an Irish Protestant Parliament in Ireland at that point, and would be through the Act of Union in 1801.
But
What
among the
we
people,
among
was
the
there?
people it's hard to tell in terms of having textual sources. What we do have are people certainly looking to the American Revolution as an inspiration for the 1798 United Irish Rising. And they talk about taking inspiration from 1776 and from 1789. And if that's the framework, then the Quebec Act actually is a problem. Because if you're taking a pro-American Republican
Right.
position, the Quebec Act was evil. But we do have a rise in Catholics, Scottish Catholics, Irish Catholics, English Catholics coming to British North America after the Act. It's nothing like we would see later in the 1820s or during the cholera epidemic, or certainly with the Irish famine, but it is growing. And we're able to see Catholics coming here and perhaps not knowing that they still have property qualifications about whether or not you can vote, but just feeling that it's not a penal law colony, whereas Ireland very much was being treated as a colony even after the Act of Union in 1801.
Question from Doug Grant. Carleton was governor when the Americans took Montreal and fought in Quebec City. Did he have a military position or military training? or was he more of a natural leader who people viewed as the battle leader?
He'd been in the military since the late 1730s, I believe, and had been a lieutenant by about the age of 19 or 20. And he was quartermaster general for Wolfe, so he was in charge of all of the supplies. He was the the Q to James Bond as the quartermaster. So he was wounded at the Plains of Abraham because he was the one bringing up all of the ammunition and cannons and gunpowder and things. Um, and he then was later made, during the Revolution, commander-in-chief of all of the British forces. But during the Battle of Quebec itself, he was there as the governor, as opposed to holding a specific military position. But certainly, he definitely had the military training, and the high military training in order to tell people what to do.
A question from Tino Bordenero. Other than maintaining stability and order as well as strengthening relations with French Canadians, were there other significant reasons for maintaining the seigneurial system?
The one I always teach about is land, in terms of the shape of land, that the seigneurial system had made sure there was access to water, because it was long rectangular shapes, whereas the British system was to cut everything into squares. And that meant that your land might no longer have the water access. So that was one geographic reason to bring it back. That would have made sense. Again, if his fear is famine, he's wanting to make sure that the harvest is going to be good. But he also just wanted to make sure that he wouldn't have to worry about Quebec if a war broke out with the 13 colonies. Everything he did, I think you can see it as a part of a larger strategy of trying to make sure that it wouldn't be a war on two fronts, that it wouldn't be, the British being caught between a war coming in Quebec again and whatever was happening down in Boston. But in terms of the seigneurial system, I would say the land aspect is the one that makes the most sense agriculturally.
So we have a follow-up here to Rod's earlier question. Do you think people forgot Carleton because he doesn't make a very good modern hero? He accepted legal and religious pluralism, which is laudable, but he had no time for small R republicanism. So, do people look at him with too much presentism, as they say in history?
Well, I mean, he was lauded in Canada for a very long time. Within Quebec, debatable, but certainly in areas where like the townships where there were United Empire loyalists, there was a real fondness for him all the way up to the 1930s. You can still find biographies written about him that are more hagiographic, like he can do no wrong. I don't think he fits with a post-World War II sense of modernism. Because he is a colonial figure, and those ties to British imperialism became increasingly uncomfortable for various Canadian governments, right through the patriation of the Constitution. But I would argue that in a way now, with the way that we look back on some of the colonial period where pop culture's references for it, he does fit. He has this crazy romantic history that would fit a Jane Austen novel. And that certainly isn't being written about in the very dry political biographies that were being pumped out around the turn of the last century. Um, and, he wasn't a Republican, technically. Canada is still, a constitutional monarchy. And so I don't think that by his not embracing Republican values that diminished his stature. I think also just how many people are taught about the 18th century. There's a lot to teach in a history course, and most start with 1867 unless you're taking a specific pre-Confederation course. I teach about Carleton every year in my Irish and Canada course the second week, and then he's gone because I have to keep moving to get through to other things. So I think he just has been increasingly overlooked. But I think if we're going to be starting to talk about, what really counts as being Canadian, what really counts in terms of Quebecois society, I think the Quebec Act is a really important thing for people to be aware of and to be able to know what it meant. But I am a historian, so I will always say something like that.
Maybe one last question about Lord Durham. So in the
Hmm.
1830s, you have Lord Durham, who has a very different attitude. He's recommending
Mm.
assimilation of of Francophones. So what are some of the differences in Durham and Carleton's political philosophies? You know,
Yeah. Oh, Durham.
how did things change?
How did things change? There was the 1837-38 rebellion
Right.
slash risings.
Yes.
The nomenclature is changing. So, but yeah, there had been an uprising, and so Durham was trying to make sure that there would no longer be armed rebellion. And ironically, Durham looked back to what had happened in Ireland after their rising in 1798 and emulated a forced union and brought Lower and Upper Canada together into the province of Canada in 1841. Carleton had been against splitting the province of Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada in 1791. He thought that was a terrible idea because you were basically going to ensure that there would always be a rivalry between English and French, and Catholic Protestant, that you were dividing people instead of building a more pluralistic society. He didn't phrase it like that because he never phrased anything easily. But I think he had a different perspective because of having fought through the American Revolution and not an internal revolt. Whereas Durham was sent over basically to fix the problem of les patriotes. And that was his solution was to promote what is it, the two nations warring in the bosom of a single state, and that the way to fix that was to assimilate. Which goes against the basic tenets of the Quebec Act. But, you know, the Quebec Act had already started to be a little bit forgotten by that point, because the 1791 Constitution had replaced it.
Yeah, and it also kind of disregards the fact that there were a lot of English speakers fighting on the side of the Patriot.
Yeah.
Durham's analysis.
Oh,
Um,
completely. Oh, yeah. No, he was only here for, a brief time. Carleton at least had been in Quebec um, for almost 30 years by the time he finally left. So, yeah, I think he had a more informed opinion.
right. So it's 12:59. There's more questions, but unfortunately, our time is, this ends at 1. So thank you very much for attending today's event. And thank you, Jane, for your presentation today, which was very engaging.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
the best way to learn about what's coming up in our programming is to sign up for our newsletter, the QR code for which is on the screen or should be soon. If you haven't already, follow the Facebook and LinkedIn pages, the handles for which are also on the screen. And our evaluation survey will appear in your browsers once we close this meeting. In closing, we again recognize the support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise and our other funders, Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. Thank you to my colleagues, Anna Hunt for organizing this Lunch and Learn, and Lena Schumerova for her support today as well. See you next time. Thank you.